Hi, everyone. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I am the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Now in its 24th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs are meant to illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism through time, and the concept that when you listen to a witness, you become a witness, as Elie Wiesel so expertly wrote. Today, we are taking on the duty to witness a shameful moment from American history. February 19th, 2 days from now, marks the 80th anniversary of Executive Order 9066, which led to the removal and incarceration of over 100,000 Japanese Americans. As anti-Semitism is on the rise, so too is anti-Asian sentiment, and we see that this was also the case in the 1940s. During the COVID-19 pandemic, hate crimes against Asian Americans have increased dramatically, making it even more important to discuss these issues. We join with our New York community and our Asian neighbors specifically in mourning the murder of Christina Yuna Lee in her home in Chinatown. As a Holocaust museum, we recognize what prejudice and hatred can lead to, and we stand with the Asian American community. We would like to thank Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, for co-presenting today's program in partnership with the museum. We're honored to be joined by Ann Curry, along with our speakers Sam Mihara, John C. Yang, and Eric L. Muller. Sam Mihara is a second-generation Japanese American Nisei, born and raised in San Francisco. When World War II broke out, the United States government, using armed military guards, forced Sam, age 9, and his family to move to the Heart Mountain Wyoming prison camp. After the war ended, he became an engineer and joined the Boeing company, where he became an executive on space programs. Following retirement, Sam became a national speaker on the topic of mass imprisonment in the United States. Since 2014, he has been a board member of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, the nonprofit organization that oversees the National Historic Landmark Site. John C. Yang is the president and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, in Washington, D.C., where he leads the organization's mission to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and to build and promote a fair and equitable society for all through policy advocacy, education, and litigation. He has served in leadership positions for the American Bar Association, the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, and the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, among many others. Prior to Advancing Justice AAJC, John had served as a political appointee in the Obama administration, the Asia Pacific legal director of a Fortune 200 company, and as a partner at a large DC-based law firm. He also serves on the Diversity Council for several Fortune 500 US companies. Eric L. Muller is the Dan K. Moore Distinguished Professor in Jurisprudence and Ethics at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. For almost 25 years, he has studied and published about the wartime removal and imprisonment of Japanese Americans. His work has appeared in many law reviews, in the popular press, in museum exhibitions, in a podcast, and in 3 published books. A 4th book on the complicity of professionals in the administration of the Japanese American camps is due out in the spring of 2023. He is also the son and grandson of German Jewish refugees who, unlike many less fortunate relatives, were able to get out of Germany with their lives at the end of 1938. Ann Curry, an award-winning former network international correspondent and news anchor, has reported about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II throughout her career, most recently in the PBS documentary series We'll Meet Again, and for National Geographic magazine. She is also the recipient of a Simon Wiesenthal Center Medal of Valor for her persistence in reporting about genocide. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us, and I'm now going to hand things over to Ann.
Thank you, Sydney, and the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and welcome everyone to what will likely be an illuminating discussion, given the caliber of our guests, about what exactly happened, what forces caused it to happen, and what perspective this can give us about the rise of hate and violence in our own time. First, Sam Mihara, yours is an increasingly rare voice, Sam, because you can describe firsthand what happened 80 years ago. What do you remember most about being forced to live behind barbed wire at the age of 9?
Well, thank you very much, Ann. I appreciate the opportunity to give you a brief talk. I'm going to share a screen and share some slides that I think will get the point across as to what it really felt like. You should see my file. And let's go to, here we go, wait a minute. Slideshow from the start. Okay. The problem began a long time ago. Even before I was born, there was hate against all Asians. And this is an example of the political cartoon at that time. Is an Asian with a bloodied knife and a smoking gun standing on top of this woman he just killed. The caption, "Yellow terror threatens white women." They used to call us yellow in those days, but that was a scene that we had experienced. This is well before I was born. Let me introduce you to my family. That defiant brat with the folded arms, that's me. I was about 7 years old in this photograph. My father next behind me, and my brother next to me, my mother standing to the right, Grandpa and Grandma Mihara seated. The elder Miharas were the immigrants. They're the ones who came across. My father was well educated in Japan with a major in English. As a result, he had no problems getting a job in San Francisco as a newspaper reporter in a bilingual newspaper. And he met my mother. They were married. As a result, I was born. My brother was born. We are American citizens by birth. Very important distinction. After Pearl Harbor, life became miserable for people, especially of Japanese ancestry. But we were deluged with these kinds of political ads. Here's a Japanese soldier with a bloodied knife, a Nazi German soldier with his weapon, and they're encroaching upon the continental United States. And the caption, "Our homes are in danger now." Well, that implies it's the local people of Japanese and German ancestry who are the real threats during World War II. Dorothea Lange, famous photographer, was assigned to go to San Francisco and take pictures of the Japanese people as a part of a documentary on what really happened. So she came to my grammar school. These are my grammar school buddies. They're fourth graders. A guy in a striped t-shirt, a good friend of mine, he went by the name of Hisashi Kobayashi. And by the way, all of us who had these strange, hard to pronounce names, we all developed nicknames. In this case, he called himself Kobe, like the basketball player. And so Kobe's been my friend forever. The most important photograph taken by Dorothy is this one right here. It's an iconic photo of the second grade 7-year-old girls doing their morning Pledge of Allegiance. And you can tell by the facial expressions when they give that pledge, I pledge allegiance to the flag. They really mean it. You can sense their sincerity and dedication to the United States of America. And that's why Dorothea took this photo, been used in many, many opportunities in books and museums. So Dorothea kept taking more photographs. Here's one of the headlines in San Francisco. Ouster of all, and then the J word is in California is near. That got the people all excited, the readers saying, "Oh, it's time to move these people out of here." So the hysteria developed. I remember this billboard went up a half a block from my house. Half a block, and this huge billboard says, "Bye bye," and the J word. I mean, how would you like it if somebody in your neighborhood, they put up a sign, a billboard that said, "Bye bye," whatever the racial group or religious group, whatever. That would be awful, but that happened back in 1942. Whoops. There we go. All right, so the after Executive Order 9066 was signed, President Roosevelt authorized the military to take action, and General John DeWitt ordered all Japanese and even part Japanese from the Western states to be removed. And here we are getting on a train. The Army is shoulder to shoulder with weapons, making sure we get on. I remember getting on that train and staying on there for 3 days and nights. That was horrible. Gosh, we had cold sandwiches, sitting on hard benches until our train arrived at a place called Heart Mountain, Wyoming, a desolate country way up in the northern end of Wyoming. I remember when we got there, we saw these guards. There was our on the guard tower on the left, you see the guard with a long-range rifle pointed toward the barracks. In the middle, you see the guard tower with the floodlights. On the right side, you see these signs in English and Japanese that said, stop, don't go beyond here, otherwise you can get shot. So that defines a prison. We were inside a prison, even though it was a camp. I remember getting into the barrack the first time we got there. It was awful. It was 20 feet by 20 feet for an entire family. My family, the outlined in red, is the barrack room that we were assigned. And when we got there was no electricity, no water, there was no insulation, there was no inside walls, just the outside inner surface of the outside walls. It was like a storage shed, and that's the condition we lived in that room for 3 years. While we were there, we had a lot of problems. So one of them was my father. He had a case of glaucoma of his eyes before camp. And he was being treated in San Francisco for 20 years by a really good ophthalmologist, a surgeon who was able to maintain his eyes. Remember, this is days before medication for glaucoma. But once he got to camp, no one knew how to take care of glaucoma. There were no doctors for specialty problems like my father. And General DeWitt would not let him go back to see his specialist. As a result, Dad became blind in camp. That was a disaster for our family, both within and outside the camp. But that wasn't the worst case. The worst case was my grandfather. I watched him suffer in the hospital, and he died within a matter of about 3 short months. And I watched him as he died. He was down to skin and bones. He looked like a Holocaust survivor by the end. By the way, in that photograph, that's me in a white shirt, my father next to me, and Grandma in the veil. And I wonder what really happened. So I got a hold of his medical records a few years back, and I found a doctor knew nothing about how to treat cancer. And Grandpa apparently had a case of colon cancer. And I found out they were trying an experiment. They were using Grandpa to try something new, which is to starve the cancer out. In fact, they gave him a laxative, of all things, for colon cancer. So it's no wonder he died so quickly. Again, lack of medical care that was adequate for that occasion. So after a while, there was an attorney by the name of James Purcell in San Francisco who filed a lawsuit. And that lawsuit had all of us, in fact, Purcell filed a lawsuit which he found a lady by the name of Mitsuo Endo. And he filed a suit that's saying the government cannot hold a perfectly loyal American citizen in detention for such a long time. And as a result, the Supreme Court decided 9-0, unanimous, to let her go. And at the same time, the government decided to let everyone go who were considered to be loyal to the United States. And that's how we got out before the end of the war. In December 1944 is when they decided to let us go. So here we are getting on the train to go back home. And when we got home, life became even more difficult at that time. Let's see, my slides aren't advancing. Here we go. We were greeted by these kinds of images. They told us to keep moving. Don't stop where we used to live. And that hate resulted in loss of jobs, and many of our homes were gone. It was very, very difficult for all of us. So I want to conclude with a thought: why did these prison camps exist? And the answer is, I told you, there was racial prejudice, clearly, and there was hysteria, mainly as a result of the media causing the hysteria among the readers. But most important, some of the leaders in this country failed to honor our constitutional rights. And when you have a combination of these three, again, it could certainly happen to anyone. And I simply say, never, never again to anyone at all. So that concludes my brief summary. I do have a book that I wrote. You're welcome to it. You can see it on my website and www.sammihara. And also on the website, you can ask for me to come to your location and give a presentation. I'd love to do that. So thank you all, and thank you, Anne, for the introduction. And let me stop sharing and get back to the program.
All right, Sydney, or Sam, thank you so much for going through all of that. And I want to now turn to Professor Eric Muller, a leading scholar on this question that you raised at the very end of your talk, Sam. You know, does when you think about the cause, the reasons, what specifically turned this country away from its own ideals and caused it to incarcerate more than 110,000 people, 2/3 of them citizens, including small children, the very old, without due process, purely on the basis of race. Does most of the blame lie in fury and prejudice, which was unleashed after the bombing, in the outrage after the bombing of Pearl Harbor? Or would it have happened without the power of politics and also misinformation, Professor?
It's a great question, Anne, and hello, everybody. I wanted to also, just before I dive into my answer, I wanted to extend my thanks as well to the Museum of Jewish Heritage and to my co-panelists and to you, Anne, for a very, very important conversation at a very important moment, you know, just a day or two shy of the 80th anniversary of the signing of Executive Order 9066. I think we're especially fortunate still to be able to hear from Sam. And this is a point of connection, I think, between the Japanese American community and the Jewish community. The tragedy that befell Japanese Americans and the horrors that befell the Jews of Europe were roughly contemporaneous with each other. And so just as there are very few people around who can remember, who were old enough to remember what happened in Europe, the same thing is true as to a camp like Heart Mountain. So we should all consider ourselves very fortunate to have had this opportunity to hear directly. On the question, Anne, that you raised, certainly the items that Sam presented on his slide were all significant factors in creating the circumstances that led to the signing of Executive Order 9066. There was one item, though, that was not on the slide, which I know Sam would agree with, and that is economics. And here, too, is another, I think, point of connection between what befell Japanese Americans and what happened to the Jews of Germany in particular. The Japanese, the ethnically Japanese on the West Coast, were extraordinarily successful farmers. Farming often in circumstances where they were not allowed to own the very land they were farming because of laws that made it illegal for essentially for Asian immigrants to own land. So renting their land, they still nonetheless managed to become producers of the major portions of many to most of the truck vegetables that were eaten up and down the West Coast and elsewhere. And this obviously was a source of great resentment to the white farmers in those regions, who long had as an objective, not just for xenophobic reasons, but also for cash, for straight up money reasons, had very strong incentives to want the Japanese gone. And so it's odd to say it this way, but in a strange sense, the attack at Pearl Harbor for white agribusiness along the West Coast, Pearl Harbor was in a perverse sense a dream come true, because it finally gave a pointed opportunity, a pointed argument to bring into effect what they had been lobbying for and wanting for quite some time, which was the uprooting and removal of their economic competitors. If you look carefully at the timeline after December 7th, what you see is, first of all, the Justice Department swept into action and arrested a couple of thousand Japanese immigrant men, along with some German aliens and Italian aliens. The FBI's position was, we have this under control. There's no need to do any kind of mass action against Japanese Americans. That was the Justice Department's position as well. Even the military at first was really not contemplating mass action against every person of Japanese ancestry. But it was the pressures that were brought to bear late in December into January from these economic interests, from these xenophobic interests, catching the ears of their congressional delegations, and also catching the ears very much of prominent journalists who began writing editorials in the month of January of 1942, calling for much more drastic action against Japanese Americans. General DeWitt was not initially a supporter of the idea of mass removal of everyone, but he came around to that idea in significant measure because of these racist, economic, and xenophobic pressures that were being brought to bear through the mass media and through the congressional delegations. You put all that together, that's a pretty toxic mix. And ultimately, in the battle between the War Department and the Justice Department, the War Department wanting to take mass action ultimately, and the Justice Department insisting it wasn't necessary, it was the War Department that really got Franklin Roosevelt's ear. And that was why, again, 80 years ago, from 2 days from now, he put his pen to Executive Order 9066.
You know, you mentioned the Holocaust, and it should be said that you were also a scholar, in addition to the subject at hand, also a scholar of the Holocaust, and as well the son of Holocaust victims and refugees. Given that you have researched both of these travesties in history, have you found similar trend lines or warning signs that can help us better understand how a government convinces its people to justify the kinds of persecution that happen in both of these instances? In other words, the economic interests of farmers aside, there is a message, there's a messaging that is required for citizens of a nation to agree to go along with it.
Absolutely. Certainly, one very clear point of commonality between both stories, and I want to point out that, you know, by the end of the episode, by the 1940s, the stories had obviously diverged significantly, right? With death camps in Europe, which were very different places from the kinds of places that Mr. Mihara and his family and others were in. Nonetheless, the scapegoating of an internal enemy that can easily be segregated and defined is an age-old strategy of totalitarian leaders. The pointing of fingers, the blaming of an internal enemy for an external problem or for other internal problems is a very strong point of contact between what happened to Japanese Americans and what happened to the Jews of Germany, and then later Austria, and of course the rest of Europe. So I think that this messaging around, you know, some of the images, for example, that Sam presented, you can find very similar kinds of images caricaturing Jews as well, that became part of the propaganda underpinning of the demonization of the Jew as the enemy of the German people. So in that sense, I think there's a very strong connection. Another unfortunate connection is, you know, I guess what we might call othering, but in the specific context of the first part of the 20th century, both Germany and the United States were very much in the grips of this very biological understanding of race. Jews were understood in Europe and Germany to be a racial group, not a religious group. Just as the Japanese, as General DeWitt said in his final report, the Japanese race is an enemy race. So the conflation of what we today might think of as, you know, sort of ethnic background or identity with attributes of character, with untrustworthiness, with graspingness, with any of that kind of connection of some basic component of a person's identity, which they can't choose, and a constellation of negative stereotyped attributes. These are points of great commonality between both stories, and probably many other situations around the world in which some vulnerable internal minority group was scapegoated and imprisoned or worse.
Mm-hmm. You know, today we're all seeing, as Sydney was talking about, hate crimes against Jewish, African American, Muslim, as well as Asian people. And John Yang, you work to protect people as executive director of the Asians Americans Advancing Justice. So I'd like you to talk about what is the level of anti-Asian hate today. Give us some perspective on what's happening today.
Well, thank you, Anne, and thank you to the Museum of Jewish Heritage for inviting us. This is an important conversation, and I very much appreciate how Sam and Eric framed this conversation, because certainly for the Asian American community today, and seeing the level of violence, the level of hate that we're seeing, that has the same elements that led to the Holocaust, that led to the incarceration of Americans of Japanese descent. Luckily, we're not at the same space. I am not in any way claiming that this is an equivalent. But we need to have this conversation in a smart way. The framing to me is one of fear, is one of misinformation, disinformation, and is one of what can leaders do. You know, on the fear point, I think that's exactly right. Why we are seeing hate against the Asian American community is at bottom fear. It's natural when COVID-19 first hit our shores to have fear of this new virus, this new disease, and how we can catch it. Unfortunately, there are those that seized on that fear. And to Eric's point, sort of pinpointed it on the other by calling it the Chinese virus, the Wuhan flu, worse derivations such as Kung flu. And to the points that are being made, to have leaders sanction that. We're not a partisan organization, but we're going to call out leaders who are not helping our community, that are not protecting our community. And in this case, President Trump went out of his way to call this by those types of names. And what we saw naturally was this backlash or this vitriol against our Asian American community as a result of that. And Sam and Eric is absolutely right. This is nothing new. Whenever people have fear, they look for someone to blame, some entity to blame. And in this particular case, the Asian American community was put in those crosshairs because of the words used by leaders and the misinformation, disinformation that was out there. But I also want to be clear right now about what this anti-Asian hate looks like and what we need to do in the future. Because even as COVID-19 progresses to a different stage, I don't want to ever say that we have it under control because I think it's so unpredictable. But independent of COVID-19, we still have that fear element with respect to the Chinese government. And here, I think the analogies are wonderful in the sense of tragically wonderful to economic fears as to the competitiveness of China, political fears as to what the Chinese government are doing. Again, some of that are legitimate fears. I think it is legitimate for us to call out the Chinese government for their human rights violations with respect to the Xinjiang province and the Uyghurs, the Muslim minority there. It is legitimate to talk about democracy and what is happening in Hong Kong. And it's even legitimate to talk about anti-competitive behavior by the Chinese government. But even as we do that, we have to separate what is happening between governments, the Chinese government and the United States government, and what is happening between people. Because that fear cannot be used to justify violence, prejudice, racism against a whole class of people. And again, that is unfortunately what we see happening. And Sam and Eric are absolutely right. We've seen that throughout history. Whether it is with respect to the incarceration of Japanese Americans, whether it is after 9/11, when, again, legitimate terrorist attacks on the United States, that we needed to defend our shores, so to speak, and address those issues. But we saw that backlash against the South Asian, Muslim, Middle Eastern population here in the United States, where we literally had murders of individuals because of their religious beliefs, because of what they looked like. So on one level, we have to kind of break that down, make sure we understand that, and then think about how we address that. I think the other thing that's important about all of this is making sure we have the right information, right? Because even as there's this fear out there, as Sam said, it generates hysteria too. And part of that hysteria, especially in this age of social media, is how images gets transmitted. One of the things even I will have to say within the Asian American community that I'm frustrated by is the level of understanding about what is causing this violence, who is causing it, and how we could respond to it. One of the pieces of misinformation and perhaps even disinformation that we are seeing is that somehow it is the African American community that is committing these heinous acts on the Asian American community. And I'm going to be very, very direct about this. Statistically, that's not true. There's been a study done by NIH, the National Institute of Health, a study done by the University of Michigan that shows that approximately 75%, slightly over 75% of the attackers of Asian Americans are Caucasian. Majority of those, large majority of those are Caucasian males. It's only a very small minority, 5% in the University of Michigan study, that are African Americans. Why do I want to be that explicit about it? Let's be real. If you look on some of the viral video feeds that we've seen of Asian Americans being attacked, and here again, I'll call out that it's typically Asian American women that are suffering the most. Those videos typically are of an African male that's attacking them. So that's painting a very different picture than what the reality is. And some of this, I think, is, again, fear-driven and driven in a way to try to divide our communities, divide the African-American community from the Asian-American community, and have us point fingers at each other. And this is something that we all just have to be very, very conscious of and push back against that narrative. Because for me, certainly during this period of fear, of economic fear, health fear, it's not lost on me that as Asian Americans are being attacked, we've seen record levels of anti-Semitism. We have seen the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. The list is too long to name. That to me is the bigger narrative that we all need to be working on together and not fall into the trap of some of this disinformation that's trying to divide our communities.
Well, let's talk about how we work on this, because you've been forging bonds not just with other Asian groups, but you've reached out and have forged a bond with the NAACP, and at the same time, you've been willing to acknowledge that Asian Americans have not always been great allies in the past. So what are you hoping will be this future that you're moving towards, and what difference can these allyships, as they're called, actually make in protecting people from this tide of hate?
Yeah, that's a great question. And with respect to what difference that makes, that means that if you have an individual case where there is an African American that attacked an Asian American, we can have a different conversation. We don't start to point fingers right away. We start to address some of the root causes. Frankly, some of the root causes are often socioeconomic. As we've seen with a lot of these attacks, actually, many of them have to do with mental wellness and mental health. So we can start having that different conversation. And it's difficult because let's be honest, again, if we're talking about the Asian American community, we have not always shown up for the African American community. Part of that is historical, because if you think about how Asian Americans came over, we are the most recent immigrants. Back in 1960, when the civil rights movement was really getting going, we're only 0.5% of the US population. So our understanding of civil rights is different. Our understanding of the contributions of the African American community to the rights that we as Asian Americans have looks different, right? So making sure we have that understanding, acknowledging our deficiencies, because I think if we acknowledge our vulnerabilities to each other, we could create that level of trust and have some of these, there are difficult conversations, but have these difficult conversations. Break down these stereotypes. One of the stereotypes that we have that we've talked a little bit about is this notion of Asian Americans being sort of a model minority, the minority that does well. Well, why was that stereotype created? It was, again, created to divide us, suggest that, well, we can't have racism in the United States if there's a minority group that is doing so well. It must be because other minority groups are doing something wrong, or it's somehow their fault that they're not succeeding. And we know that's not true. So we need to have that different conversation so that we break down some of those barriers.
I want to get back to each one of you, but I also want to make sure that we leave time for questions. So I'm going to ask you to be really pretty disciplined in your answers to the next questions. In other words, keep your answers as short as you can. Sam, while the US government has since acknowledged that it made a mistake and apologized, you were among those who say it could happen to a group of Americans again. Why?
I think you're on mute, Sam.
Sam, we can't hear you. You want to unmute yourself? I tell you what, while Sam is figuring that out, Eric, I'm going to go to you and I'll come back to you, Sam. Eric, what is the best way to prevent this from happening again?
Well, I mean, some of it is to keep an eye on the courts. You know, when it comes to violations of civil liberties, the courts obviously failed Japanese Americans, with the exception of the Endo case, which Sam did mention. But in the key constitutional cases, the Supreme Court failed Japanese Americans miserably. And I might add, so did the Justice Department. There's well-known stories of some sort of foul play in the ways in which the Justice Department presented the cases about Japanese American incarceration to the Supreme Court. So, you know, back in 1943 and 1944, the courts failed. Many people think that the law has developed in very healthy ways since then, and that the law would stand up, the court would stand up to efforts to single out groups and place burdens on them in the future. You know, I think there's reason to be concerned about that. I think the evidence is mixed. You know, a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court finally did overturn, or said they overturned, the Koromatsu decision, something that was long, long overdue. But sadly, they did it in a case in which they were approving of the President Trump's order barring people from certain Muslim majority countries from entering the United States, which is itself something that echoes a little bit in some of the kinds of animus that was behind the removal and imprisonment of Japanese Americans 80 years ago. So I think that keeping an eye on the courts is a very, very important part of the puzzle here.
And John, I'm sure as a lawyer, you would probably likely agree with that. Before I get to you though, Sam, I'm going to see if Sam can hear me. Sam, why do you think it could happen again? You're still on mute, Sam. Can you unmute yourself? Okay, well, we're gonna, Sam, see the button on the lower left. Take a quick look and unmute yourself if you can. Maybe the, technical problems are a part of all of this. Let me ask you then, John, how hard, it's so hard for many people not to feel helpless when we hear about these stories against all kinds of people. And so I think many of us have started to ask, what, if anything, can we do? What can any one person do? You're in the hot seat. How would you answer that question?
There's a couple of quick things. First is be an upstander, or what we would call be a bystander. If you see an act of hate committed against someone else, there are a lot of little things that you could do that you could protect that victim. Whether it is just simply going up to them and saying afterwards, hey, are you okay? If you're comfortable enough in that moment to go up to that person, that victim, and say, hey, where do you need to go? Let me help you get there. If you're comfortable enough to say, hey, that's racist, stop that, right? Even while it's happening. Little things that make a huge amount of difference to that victim. The other thing that we should do is think about how do we be allies to each other, right? Like what that means to me is if I'm with an African-American friend and someone else asks him, why are you talking about Black Lives Matter? Why can't we talk about all lives matter? It's up to me to tell that other person, here's why Black Lives Matter, and not force that responsibility on my African-American friend. Just like I would hope, like the Asian Americans, we always get asked the question, well, where are you really from? As if we're not from the United States. I would want a friend of mine that's not Asian American to say, hey, he's from Chicago. That's the accent that you're hearing. It's a Midwestern accent. To take that responsibility away, not force us to always define our own identities for ourselves and justify our own existence. So those are some small things that I think do go a long ways to establishing that connection that we all need to feel.
And I'm sure you agree that this is an idea, an activity, this idea of standing up for others would include all kinds of people. If you hear anti-Semitism, if you hear anti-Native American comments, I mean, there's an idea, why would you allow it in your house? Why would you allow it around your children? Sort of being able to sort of stand up and say, no, this is not acceptable is a way is a way of starting or being a part of a wave, just as we are now part of experiencing the wave coming the other direction. So a little comment from me, probably unnecessary. Sam, I'm going to give you one more chance to see if I can hear you. Can you just say something? I am so sorry, Sam. We can't hear you, Sam. I think we're really lucky that we were able to hear anything from Sam, given how rare it is to have a voice of Sam, like Sam's, and I really appreciated your presentation, Sam. I want to then now, as a result of that, I want to open up to audience questions and see what has come in. And to do that, I'm going to bring back Sydney Yeager and the Museum of Jewish Heritage to take us through those questions. Sydney?
Thank you so much, Anne. So I think to begin, we got one question that's asking, no one ever talks about the fact that Italian Americans and German Americans were not subject to the same treatment as Japanese Americans, and therefore the Japanese imprisonment was very racially based. And this person is asking if anyone wants to comment on this and kind of anything about that.
Eric, why don't you take that?
Well, in some ways, I would disagree maybe a little bit with the premise of the question. I think that it's actually one of the key ways in which all of the government's actions have come to be critiqued retrospectively is to really focus in on the fact that, if you were little George Takei, who is now, we all know, to be George Takei, if you were George Takei, you were rounded up as an American citizen. You were rounded up and sent off to a concentration camp, an American concentration camp, American style, in Arkansas. If you were Joe DiMaggio, the son of Italian immigrants, or if you were Lou Gehrig, the son of German immigrants, you were not touched. So I think that that distinction between Japanese Americans on the one hand and German and Italian Americans on the other hand is actually the thing that really kind of points up the truly racial nature of the judgment that was made and the perception of who was dangerous and who was not dangerous.
You've made the point, Eric, I'm going to jump in because you've made the point that the government, when it made the decision to incarcerate these thousands of people, more than 110,000 people, about 115,000, it was really purely on race. You could be a guy who, was walking with a stick because you could barely walk upright and you're incarcerated. There were children who were orphans, isn't that right? Who were rounded up even though they didn't have parents, and they were taken to a camp. I mean,
That's right.
Really, and the law allowed this.
Well, the law, yes, the law came to allow it. They were kind of making it up as they went along, frankly. There were lawful ways of taking certain actions against non-citizens from Japan, Germany, and Italy. And there were small numbers of those quote unquote lawful actions that were taken. But the thing that's distinctive about what happened to Japanese Americans as a community is that there was a completely new kind of incarceration that was just dreamed up basically out of the thin air that was, as you say, Anne, explicitly based on race. And there's, we don't need to, sometimes these kinds of arguments, people hear them and they say, oh gosh, that's 21st century racial attention, looking back on it. No, when you read John DeWitt's report that he filed to explain the action he had just taken, as I said before, his rationale was that the Japanese race is an enemy race. I'm quoting him. And then he went on to say, and even though the children who are born in the United States have been somewhat Americanized, the racial strains, as if we're talking about a bacteria, the racial strains in the children are undiluted down from the parents. So this was plainly, flatly, clearly a race-based decision at the time it was made.
And by the way, we should mention that John DeWitt was the military commander in charge of the West Coast, President Roosevelt gave the military commanders the power to make these decisions based on the regions that they were in charge of. Sydney, what's the next question?
So I think the next question is also may also be directed to Eric, but from a Jewish perspective, this person has heard some say that using the term concentration camp for Heart Mountain and other prisons is problematic. This person disagrees, but they are curious if we could discuss this issue.
There's a very interesting history here, Eric. Jump in.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that for a moment or two. And obviously, this is something that I've had to struggle with in my own scholarship as a person who had family members who perished in the camps in Europe and also studies the camps in the United States. The fact of the matter is that the term concentration camp is an historically authentic term as applied to the camps in which Japanese Americans were placed. Everybody from Sam Mihara to Franklin Roosevelt in the vernacular at the time referred often to the camps in which Japanese Americans were placed as concentration camps, rather than what the government preferred to call them, which was the euphemism of a relocation center. Now, obviously, in the wake of the end of World War II, when the world learned about the horrors of Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor, Belzec, as the world learned about those camps, and those images began to expand and define the term concentration camp in the American English, there comes a point of tension there. And I don't know of any Japanese American who ever suggests that the conditions in the camps in the United States were remotely like the conditions at the camps I've just listed. Nonetheless, it is important to recognize that the term is an historically authentic term, that it is quite literally the definition of a concentration camp is when you concentrate a people that have been singled out on the basis of some attribute and lock them up. You are concentrating them. And then the last point I want to make, it's a point about the sensitivity of the term. I know and even in my own family, Jewish people, particularly those who have family that were in the camps or refugees, are understandably very, very sensitive of and sort of protective towards that history. And I share that myself. The thing that's really interesting to see, though, is that arguing or being sensitive about the term concentration camp is not just a post-war phenomenon. In 1942, before most of the camps I just listed were even built, and people were calling the Japanese American camps concentration camps, there were people in the United States government and there were justices on the US Supreme Court who were taking offense at the idea that you would call Heart Mountain a concentration camp. This is long before anybody knew about the horrors of Auschwitz in the United States. So what I think we have there is not just a certain protectiveness towards the memory of those who perished at Auschwitz. We also can see from that 1942 sensitivity an American reluctance to own up to the idea that we might create some pretty miserable conditions for minority groups in our country.
And certainly there are Japanese Americans who cringe at the phrase internment camp because they feel that that is a euphemism. Sam, we can hear you. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And pardon me, my new computer, I'm having a little trouble. I think I figured it out. The thing that's going on is I'm very sensitive to people, either misusing or not applying the word concentration to the camps, but because of the correlation with the Holocaust. And what I've been told, and I've given this talk to many Holocaust museums, and invariably many of the survivors would come up and say, if you take away the gas chambers, if you take away the incinerators, there's a lot of parallel between what happened to Jews and what happened to Japanese Americans. And so what I do is I really prefer using the phrase prisons. That's really what it was. It was a prison. And that way there's not offensive to anyone who feels sensitive about it. So it's really a case of terminology, and that's what I like to do, is to simply call it what it is. It was a prison.
Sydney, do you have another question?
I do. So this person asks, would you say that the comeback in recent decades of blind originalism regarding constitutional interpretation, this is a bit more legal, create further ignorance and fuel more hate and fear? And if it does, what is the best way to combat it?
Do you want to jump into this, John, or do you want to take this, Eric?
John, be my guest if you'd like.
Sure. I mean, it's an interesting question, and at least for me, and Eric, you're much more a constitutional scholar than I am, but my notion of the Constitution has always been that it is a document that our founders, and again, I want to be very careful when we talk about our founders, but our founders created with wisdom that they weren't able to answer all the questions at the time. So it had enough flexibility, it had enough elasticity to adapt with the times. And so this notion of originalism, if you're trying to get at what the original intent of the founders were, at least by all accounts that I've read, the intent was for the document to be withstand through time, even as our country developed in ways that they did not expect. Mm-hmm. Some of this debate, to me, is frustrating because it gets into this question of what really is originalism.
I agree with everything John has said, but I would add just a couple of thoughts. And that is that I think it's important in a world, in a context in which we're resisting demonization. I think it's important for us also to resist demonizing people who believe in a particular mode of constitutional interpretation. Everybody on the Supreme Court agrees that the original meaning of the words in the Constitution is an important component of figuring out what the Constitution means. And it's also very important, it's often forgotten that the commitment to original meaning sometimes drives justices to places that are not allied with what we understand to be politically conservative positions. There are many cases in the area of criminal law and criminal procedure, for example, in which a commitment to the original understanding of the right to confront witnesses or the right to privilege against self-incrimination leads even very conservative justices to conclusions that in a political sense we might call progressive or liberal. So I would caution against that kind of demonization if we can avoid it.
Sydney, are there any more questions that we can get to before? Because I have some more if you'd like.
Yeah, I have a couple of other ones. So do you think the current pushback in certain areas for critical race theory will restart the old prejudice, excuse me, thinking of the past? Possibly, yeah, sorry, that's the end of the question.
John, what do you think?
Can you repeat the question? I'm not sure if I...
Sure. Let me get back to it. Do you think that the current pushback in certain areas of the country for critical race theory will restart old prejudice thinking of the past?
Unfortunately, it has. I think that's right. And I find it frustrating because the term critical race theory is now being weaponized. I mean, for me, sort of what we should focus on is what is it that we're trying to teach our kids? If we're focusing on K through 12 education, as much of this debate is about, right? If what people are saying is that we shouldn't teach kids about race, I don't understand that, right? If we shouldn't teach kids about subjects that are a little bit uncomfortable, I don't understand that. Because by definition, how we've taught our kids up until now, frankly, has made most of us on this panel uncomfortable because it's excluded us from that history. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't revere in some ways and talk about how great our founding fathers were. That's not our intent. That's not what most people are talking about. All we're saying is, yeah, we should recognize that our founding fathers also had faults as well. Some of them owned slaves. Some of them were very ambivalent about their relationship with African Americans and how that worked. That's nothing shocking. It's nothing controversial. We should embrace the fact that they were humans. And then we should embrace the fact that America was made through so much more than just those white males in the 1700s. And that we should celebrate all these contributions. Like I talked about the Chinese Americans that helped to build the Transcontinental Railroad. just talking about that should not be taboo. It should not cause us to think that this is uncomfortable in some way, because then we're saying that it's uncomfortable to talk about what actual American history is.
Erica, I didn't know about the Japanese American internment until I was graduating from high school. My mother immigrated as a war bride after World War II, and I had no idea. And I found a picture of it in a library, and I thought, what country did this happen in?
Yeah.
Where did this go on?
Yeah.
And I was really shocked.
I mentioned the Koromatsu case earlier, which certainly law students and lawyers will recognize as a very, very important case in the constitutional law history. That was a case about a young man at that time named Fred Koromatsu, who refused to show up to be removed and was then prosecuted and lost his case in the Supreme Court. The reason I mention that is that his daughter is now a very, very prominent active civil rights advocate, Karen Koromatsu. And like you, Anne, this always blows me away. She had never heard about the Koromatsu case growing up until she was in high school. And she read something about the Koromatsu case, and she went home and said, "Dad, what's this Koromatsu case?" And Fred Koromatsu said, "Karen, that was me." So
Wow.
yeah, so he had never spoken, and this is so revealing of the ways in which the Japanese Americans who went through incarceration tended to deal with the trauma of what they'd been through. That he never had told his own daughter that he had made it all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. It's remarkable, isn't it?
And so, which really brings us then back to Sam and how important it is, and that he speaks out. And Sam, you've been everywhere. You speak to groups, you've spoken to students, and you have made sure that your voice has been heard. You've written books, it should be mentioned that you had a day job. You were an engineer working for Boeing, a rocket scientist. So you had this full life, but yet this was something you were not going to leave this planet unsaid. And so here you are. So we're very grateful. We just have 2 minutes left. I'd like to just give you just a little time to say the final word on our event today.
Well, let me quickly mention, I thank you, Sydney, and thanks to Anne for organizing it. This is a great program. I am very, very happy to be able to help educate people. That, after you've once taken care of your own needs and your family's needs, there's nothing better, really nothing better than to help educate people so they'll know better, that perhaps it will never happen again to others. That's a great feeling, and I enjoy doing what I'm doing.
Wow. Well, they'll know, so that people know better. All of you have been incredibly generous with your time, and I think Sam Mihara and Professor Eric Muller and John Yang, it's been a true pleasure to be in your company, to hear your thoughts. We could go on, but I know we only have an hour, Sydney.
Yeah, I would just like to echo what Anne said. Thank you to all of you. It's been such an honor, and thank you to Anne for making this such an amazing panel.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, it's truly an honor to be in all of your presences, and thank you to all of you out there in the internet verse who have joined us today. And I would like to thank Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, for co-presenting today's program. Everything we do at the museum is made possible through donor support. To those of you watching, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum or becoming a member and joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can check out at the link in Zoom chat. We also hope that you will donate to Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, which you can also find at the links in the Zoom chat. Have a great afternoon. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you to all our panelists, and thank you to Anne.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Appreciate it. Thank you much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye.